Thank you everybody for coming. This is the third, I think, in our series of research conversations, in our second year now. So thank you all for coming. Today we've got two different talks as usual, and we'll try to swap them over about 1:30. And for those of you who don't know, we have Associate Professor of Art and Archaeology, Zeynep Yürekli-Görkay, and Jeremy Johns, who's Professor of Archaeology and is, of course, the Director of the Khalili Research Centre. And they are going to talk about, I'm not even going to try to pronounce that, so I'm just going to hand it over. Let you talk about it. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you. I don't think I made enough, a sufficient number of copies of the handout, so can I ask those who have copies to share it with other people? I don't think anyone in the back has a handout.
Shall I make some?
No, it's okay. I will be referring to it, only briefly. What's that?
Very easy to make if you want.
Really? Okay. Right. Jim, don't worry about it. It's really not important. Really. It's okay. I can email everyone the handout.
Are you getting all this?
Shall I start? Yes, yeah. So the core material of my research is a corpus of manuscripts attributed to a character known as Matrakci Nasuh. I came to this topic from an interest in Ottoman dynastic historiography and the production of illustrated histories of the Ottoman dynasty in the Ottoman palace in the 16th century. Which is a bureaucratic endeavor that started officially in the 1550s. About 3 years ago, I decided that I wanted to have a proper look at 3 earlier manuscripts that are from the late 1530s, 1540s, because I thought they represented an interesting experimental phase before the official bureaucratic thing started at the court. So over time, the corpus grew as I looked at other manuscripts and realized that some of them were drafts, most of them are unillustrated, and there is a list of all the corpus on the second page of the handout. Most of these are unillustrated, but there is one manuscript in Dresden that is incredibly important because it is in fact a compilation of various half-illustrated and unillustrated drafts and draft drawings for illustrations bound in 2 volumes. So it's more than one manuscript. All of these manuscripts contain Turkish prose accounts of Ottoman military advances, and they include very detailed accounts of military campaigns. And the illustrations are all topographical views of places that were either visited or conquered by the Ottoman army during campaigns. So it's Ottoman history seen from the perspective of the soldiers who were campaigning. Various scholars have attributed the text in all of these manuscripts and the illustrations in the 3 illustrated manuscripts that I started with to Matrakci Nasuh. But there is in fact very little historical evidence for that. What we know from contemporary historical sources about Nasuh is that he was a martial arts expert. He invented the game known as matrak, and this is why he's called Matrakci. This was his claim to fame, so to speak. And from a late 16th century source, we also learned that he was skilled in the chancery scripts. But none of these manuscripts is written in a chancery script. So this is not very useful for us. What we know from manuscripts is that he wrote a book on practical arithmetics, a very small work, another small book on martial arts, And then in the 1520s, he translated at-Tabari's history into Turkish and extended it to come up to the beginning of Ottoman history. And then later on, and this is the texts I'm dealing with, he wrote 2 of the texts in the corpus attributed to him. So only 2 of these texts have his name as author. Since the 1970s and over the decades, Matrakci became known as this extraordinary character who was skilled in mathematical sciences, just because he wrote that little arithmetic manual, and arts because of the manuscripts alike. And the Turkish scholar Metin Ant called him as the perfect example of l'uomo universale, a man of the Renaissance who was skilled in many things at the same time, etc. And this interpretation of Matrakci quickly became common knowledge. Nobody questions it anymore, except maybe me. I think this says a lot about how we modern educated Turks are desperate to have the evidence for the Ottomans being part of European history. You know, we were in the Renaissance right from the beginning because of Matrakci. Just by sheer coincidence, when I went off to Turkey to do my research, to do this research, that year had been declared by the Turkish Ministry of Culture and Tourism as the year of Matrakci Nasuh. So there were conferences, exhibitions, and lots of media coverage, and lots of this Renaissance man going around. I was invited to give a talk in a conference organized in Ankara about Matrakci Nasuh and funded by the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. And unfortunately, the organizers didn't like at all what I had to say. because as soon as I started looking at the manuscripts, I realized that the illustrations couldn't have been done by one single person. And it is very, very unlikely that any of them was done by Nasuh. I was able to identify a group of manuscripts that must have been produced together. And these are definitely these first 4 manuscripts here on this handout, and possibly also these 2, because they have similarities too. I think they must have been produced together because they have the same paper with the same watermarks, same text block dimensions, same number of lines, etc. So physically they're very similar. But everything about them suggests that they were products of teamwork. So the script changes, scribes change over a manuscript, etc. And the illustrations are certainly done by different hands. So it was a teamwork, and I think Matrakci, if he played any role in this teamwork, it must have been one small part. And mind you, the only illustrated manuscript that names Matrakci as author is not part of this group. He's not mentioned in any of the manuscripts that form this group that I'm working on, which includes the 2 illustrated manuscripts that were attributed to him previously. So at the moment, I'm trying to complete a monograph on this research, but I am a bit stuck because I don't know how to proceed, because part of me wants to know what this team involved, what sorts of individuals were included in the team, what were they thinking, where did the idea come from, where were they working. I think they were probably working outside the palace, but there must have been a connection to the palace because of the content of the manuscripts, the campaign narratives that came outside, that came out of the scribal class in the palace. So these are the questions I want to answer, but I can only answer that. I may be able to answer these questions if I go off and do more research in the Ottoman archives, which is not guaranteed. I mean, I may or may not find anything useful. So that's my dilemma.
So far as I understand it, you begin with a figure who in Turkey is revered as Leonardo da Vinci.
Mm-hmm.
You show that, in fact, Leonardo da Vinci is not an individual,
Mm-hmm.
but he's a team, and most of the things attributed to Matrakci are not by him, they're done by this team of people.
Mm-hmm.
And more than that, at least one of the manuscripts is sort of unfinished, because you've got the text, but the illustrations are left to be filled in at a later date. So it looks as if whatever the project this team was working on is started and unfinished at a certain point. It's abandoned.
Absolutely. Yes.
And you're suggesting that the quality of these things and their content suggests that they're made for the palace, but do we know whether they actually end up in the palace library or when they get into the palace library?
Not before the 18th century, and this is one of the reasons I think they were probably not produced in the past. Two of them got into the palace library.
Wow.
The rest are in
So it's an experiment that's
places.
carried on outside of the palace, but
Very
writing a sort of royal history of conquests. And then it ends sometime in the 1540s.
late 1540s. And by the 1550s, we have this new project of
Right. What's the new project?
writing a verse Persian history of the Ottoman dynasty in the same meter as the Shahnameh.
So it's a
Illustrated
Suleiman-name rather than a Shahnameh.
Yes,
Written in Persian,
but the
okay.
person who is put in charge of this project is called Shehnameci, Shahnameh writer. So
That's a good office to have, isn't it? What's your job? Well, Shahnameh. Right. So why do you need to go off to the archive and do more research? To find out who is commissioning the original project?
yeah, I have a hunch
Yeah.
that one particular person was behind it, but I haven't been able to find anything to prove that. So, and that's Celalzade Mustafa. I included his name in the handout for that reason. He was head of the scribal staff during much of Süleyman's reign, and he was extremely influential. And after he retired from his position, he undertook an Ottoman history project himself,
Right.
in which he developed, just like it was done in this project, he developed the campaign narratives that he or his staff had previously written into a fuller account of the Ottoman dynasty.
So he's
Just filling in the gaps.
after he
between.
retires, he carries on the project that's abandoned in his own way. And presumably when he's in office, if he's in charge of the Chancery, he's going to be in charge, he's going to be interested in that sort of bureaucratic side of things, in supplying the army and keeping records of the army.
Yeah.
And he's not going to be that interested in a Persian verse history of
No.
Suleiman. Right, okay.
No.
So he's the one who seems to start the project and then to abandon it, and then in retirement he carries it on.
There's no proof that he was involved in the project.
Right. And you want to
But-
find the proof in the archive.
Yeah, I would love to, but
do-
I don't know if I can.
Yeah, I
And
mean,
one
what-
other thing is that's important is that the single contemporary reference to Matrakci Nasuh comes from the work that Celalzade has written.
the single contemporary reference to
To Matrakci as a
to Matra
person.
doing what as a person? The
Yeah,
only
yes.
reference to him.
Yes,
is in
I
that.
mean he wasn't that prominent. He
Okay.
wasn't Leonardo.
Right. No, I think we've got there. So, when you, let's say we encourage you to go off to the archive and spend another 5 years combing through the Ottoman archive, well, you're not going to find, you know, the letter, presumably, the letter from Jalalzadeh to Matrakci saying, thank you very much for your draft manuscripts on this. You know, that, you're not going to find that. What might you find?
I might find that.
You might
never
find
know.
that.
No, it's you never know what you will find in the Ottoman archives.
Okay.
That's the thing. But it shouldn't be. It shouldn't take 5 years to go through everything that's coming, everything available from this time period, sort of late 1530s until the end of the 40s.
Right.
So if I just, you know, because this earlier period, I mean, compared to the later 16th century period, is you know, poorer in terms of the material. That is.
I mean, it's beginning to sound like something from my own past when 30 years ago I did exactly what you've done. I decided I would look at some evidence rather than just writing stuff which other people had done about the project by the ruler of Norman Sicily, Roger II, to create an Islamicate art and architecture of his court around him. And until then, everyone had assumed that it was something he just inherited in a haphazard fashion from the Islamic past of the island. And when I started looking at the evidence, I suddenly realized that that was completely wrong, and that it had actually, the Islamic past of the island had contributed almost nothing, and it had begun with a bang in 1130 at the same time that Roger's crowned. And I had a faint suspicion that one particular man called George of Antioch, a Cilician Armenian who started off his career in the court of the Zirids in North Africa and then defected to Norman Sicily and became King Roger's chief minister, his vizier. I suspected he might be responsible for things. And already in 1986, when I first realized that things began and there was a royal project going on, I just suggested that George of Antioch might be there. And I did a bit more work on it, and then I got a bit more loud about my suggestions. So other people went to the archives. I didn't have to go to the archives. Other people went to the archives and to other things and started doing the work. And they were much more competent at doing this sort of things. So, you know, I can stumble along in Greek, but I'm not, you know, a brilliant literary analyst in Greek. And someone did some very good literary analysis of the epitaphs to George and so on. Someone happened to turn up with a biography of George hidden away in some work by Macrezy that no one had thought of looking for it in Sicily. So that, you know, other people did the work, and they are now very happy to claim that they have discovered that George of Antioch was the architect of the royal programme in Norman Sicily, which is a bit galling, but, you know, I didn't have to do the work, and I was able to publish stuff rather than sitting on it. Okay. So I think the question is whether it's worth going and spending a lot more time in the archives, or whether you publish what you've got that, you know, is fascinating already. The Turkish Leonardo, the genius of the 16th century, down the tubes, and Matrakci, you know, just a fairly minor figure, contributing to a big imperial project that gets abandoned. And I mean, I wonder why you think it gets abandoned at the time that it is abandoned.
There are a few things going on at the time in the 1550s when the other bigger project was adopted. And maybe one important thing is that after decades of war with the Safavids, the peace treaty is signed in 1555. And we think that the first Shehnameji was appointed before that, but the manuscripts that are produced, that we have, are from, you know, they start from 3 years after that. So that's one change in policy that may have contributed to this. And also, it seems to me that the group who did these manuscripts were in contact with seamen who were able to provide the topographical views, European topographical views, that some of the paintings were modeled on.
Yes.
And in the mid-40s or towards the end of the 40s, there was a major change in global politics. Somehow the Mediterranean policy of Suleiman, of the earlier reign of Suleiman, was no longer valid with the Portuguese and the Indian Ocean and all that. It's very complicated, but I don't know it in great detail.
we're somewhere between the Siege of Vienna and the Battle of Lepanto, aren't we?
Yes.
In the middle of that, when Ottoman expansion comes to an end, more or less everywhere.
Yes, comes to a halt,
Very good.
So it's the end of, Mediterranean expansion and the end of the Safavid War. So it's a period of a different kind of policy that we see in the later reign of Suleiman. Sorry.
It seems to me you've got a perfect ending to the book there, and just to suggest that it may be Celalzadeh who's behind it, and then let the other people go off into the archives, or you go into the archives for your next project and spend 5 years not finding the piece of paper that you're just
forging it.
Forging, yes. That's the other way. I think we're done.
Can we, you're happy to take a couple of questions?
Yes,
Can I throw on the floor if you have any questions for a few minutes? Anyone knows anything about this?
I don't know anything about it, but just looking like, excuse me, and maybe, forgive me if I missed something, but so you've got all these different manuscripts. I mean, it's interesting to me that there's so many different manuscripts of this, and what does that say about audience, or who is this being produced? I mean, if it was being produced for the palace, was it also being produced for other constituencies? Because why would there be so many?
These
or
are not
these
all
fragments from I wasn't quite clear on what the different manuscripts were.
Yes, they're not manuscripts of the same text.
Okay.
They're
so
different texts.
Okay, so it's not. Okay, so.
There are overlaps though,
because
the Dresden manuscript contains drafts, and parts of it overlap with the illustrated manuscripts. There's an overlap between this illustrated manuscript and another manuscript.
So does that suggest that there were, multiple copies being produced, and maybe for different sites?
No, there are very few.
Okay.
I mean, most of the texts are in a single manuscript.
Okay.
They weren't copied widely.
No, it's the project that failed, the experiment that failed.
Is that why it says when all else fails?
Sorry?
Is that what you mean by when all else fails?
No. I was referring to, the lack of archival material. That would,
So if there's only one contemporary reference to your author, when does the cult around him develop?
1970s, it's very clear.
It's as recently as that?
Yeah.
And so for purely nationalist kind of reasons then at that point, or, I mean...
Yeah, well, it's a romantic kind of idea. Oh, we have this Renaissance person who was skilled in many things.
He's not in the popular literature. He's not in the kind of
You mean
tradition of
fiction?
Popular literature before that.
He is now. But when I asked Zeynep what we were going to do, she sent me a still from a video of Matrakci fighting with Suleiman, I think. Was it
that was a very famous...
No.
That was a very popular, Magnificent Century. It's a very popular TV series that was on Turkish television several years ago. And Matrakci was one of the main characters, and he's like this bohemian guy who, drinks and goes on top of roofs to draw pictures of his beloved. It's just, really bizarre.
Okay, so can I just say thank you very much to Zeynep for that, and also to Jeremy. I'm pleased we've now learned about Jeremy's methodology for research. That's
Let other people do the work.
Make something up and let other people do it.
Have an idea.
Thank you very much. Now we'll just swap over. Right. Okay, so we will move on to a new topic. So first we have Paul Wordsworth, who is our postdoc research fellow from the Nizami program, which is for the study of languages and cultures of Azerbaijan and the Caucasus. In conversation with Ed Herzig, who is our Sudabar Professor of Persian Studies, on the subject urban life on the northern fringes of the medieval Islamic world. And thank you very much, both.
Thank you. I think I'm just going to let you go, Paul.
Introduce it. Well, I guess we're moving from something of an enigmatic person to an enigmatic place. The project which we're going to discuss briefly now is the city of Barda'a. And why is it an interesting place to study? Well, it's attested in quite a few historical sources, mainly through anecdotal material that relate to quite exciting events that happen. But they happen in this place which is a provincial capital in the Caucasus, something on the fringes of the Islamic world. And these stories create interest, but we don't know anything really about the city itself, the life in the city, or how it worked as an administrative provincial capital, particularly under the Abbasids. We know that it was probably founded in the 5th or early 6th century under the Sasanians. We know that it then inherited a role as being a sort of provincial hub in the Caucasus. And then we know that it declined. We're not quite sure exactly at what point it declined, but traditionally and historically speaking, we're saying it declined in the 10th century AD. Now, where am I talking about? Well, unfortunately, I did want to put up a map, but I'm going to have to use some descriptive geography to try and place you where I'm talking about, because it's not an area which everybody is familiar with. So if I can get you all to imagine the Caucasus mountain range sort of cutting east-west, then just down from that, if you place yourselves directly between the Caspian and the Black Sea, if I haven't lost you already, somewhere around Tbilisi. Now the Kura River flows through Tbilisi and heads out towards the Caspian Sea. And if we were to continue in a straight line, we'd hit Baku, the wonderful oil port of Baku. But I want you to ignore that for the time being. We're following the Kura River and we're taking a sharp bend to the right, and the Kura River actually turns southwards towards Iran. And it flows through a relatively flat plain. On a good day, you can still see both sets of the Caucasus Mountains, the greater and the lesser. But actually, then you want to head down the Kura River, and it's on this very flat plain that at one point did have a lot of trees, thanks to the Soviets no longer. And it's just on this wide plain that the city of Barda'a is located. So why am I saying it's enigmatic if we know a reasonable amount about it, and it's also a historic toponym, and we know where it is? Well, there's a modern city with the name Barda'a, but if you were to go there today, there isn't very much to see on the ground. All there is in terms of historical remains, and this is no small thing, is a nice mausoleum from 1322, placed in the centre of the city, surrounded by a mud brick wall. And so this research project really wanted to find out what is the city of Barda'a in terms of an administrative provincial capital. This ties into my broader research interests, which is to try and think about frontier cities in the Islamic world and how they're different in any way from those which you might consider at the core of states, and whether there are in fact any differences. But particularly what I'm interested in Barda'a is to try and reconstruct something of urban life, because we simply don't have a picture of it from historical sources. So what do we do? Well, this is, as I haven't pointed out yet, but mainly an archaeological exploration. So we're looking beneath the ground for signs of material culture and what that might tell us about Barda'a in the past. We have various areas where we might decide to excavate, but it seems a jolly good idea to put right in the centre of the modern town, notwithstanding all of the practical difficulties of actually doing that. And as I've mentioned, part of the context of that is this 1322 mausoleum. It gives us a point in time when a mausoleum was built in the centre of the city, and at that point it seems that at least immediately around it nothing else was constructed. So we've been excavating from that point downwards to see how the city developed. Now, it's a very small window in terms of looking archaeologically speaking. We'd like to get a bit more information than just one small 5 by 5 metre or 10 by 10 metre now area in the city. And so what we've been trying to do is actually also look at this in the broader landscape scale. So we're looking around the modern city to look at other archaeological sites, in particular one other site where we're excavating, but also just to look at the landscape and to see what this interaction might be between the city and the rural sites in, well, particularly at the moment the 10th to the 13th centuries. That's the window we're focusing on before moving back a little bit earlier. And this has produced some interesting results. We're looking at things such as landscape development, field systems, and as I say, one rural site in particular which seems to have quite a turbulent history with a dramatic fire ending the settlement history in about the 10th or 11th century, and we're investigating that. So we've got all of these different approaches to essentially one question. It's trying to understand this province and the mechanisms of it in terms of being an urban administrative centre.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I'd like to begin by asking you what exciting things happened, because you've tickled people's curiosity, but you haven't told us anything about what actually these events were. I mean, what are some of the exciting moments in the history of Barda that made contemporary historians write about it?
Well, it's the seat of more than one revolt, and part of the sort of turbulence of the history of Barda is the fact that as an administrative centre, when a revolt happens, it's capturing this city that seems to actually turn the tables, and then recapturing this city people want to then re-establish power. But the most sort of interesting anecdotal point that many historians of the area have actually looked on in more detail is the arrival of the Rus. So some swarthy band of Russians sailed down the Caspian and up the Kura River and tried to take over Barda in the Caucasus in 943. It's not very clear why they were there. We've got a reasonably detailed account in Miskoué, and he actually recalls how the invaders come up the river. They besiege the town for a year. There are all sorts of strange events, such as intermarriages with locals, as well as various different negotiations. But the inhabitants of Barda hold out for a year, and then, unfortunately for the invaders, they're struck by a bout of dysentery, whereupon they flee in very reduced numbers and are never heard of again. And there are sort of other apocryphal images in these tales, such as giant fish in the river and so on and so forth. But it's vignettes like this that give us an idea of the character of the city, particularly its isolation in terms of gaining help from actually other parts of the Islamic world, but then later on local dynasties. But they don't really give us a sense of what it's actually like to live there. We have a few accounts in 10th century geographies, Arab geographies, about certain aspects of the city, but they're mostly praising its healthy climate, or by the 11th century, the unhealthy climate, seemingly, and sort of what it produces and where it's going. It's famous for its slaves and its donkeys, amongst other things.
Right, thank you. So we have a few events of an exciting kind in written sources. We have a 13th century mausoleum. You have a trench, 10 metres by 10 metres, yeah. Roughly, next to this mausoleum.
Yeah.
I mean, if one wanted to be devil's advocate and suggest that Barda might have moved 5 kilometres between the time that the Rus arrived and the time that the mausoleum was built, and that you could be digging in entirely the wrong place, would you hold your hands up and say that's a fair point, or are there things that would make you very confident that where you're digging is where the Barda of the 10th century was and flourished?
There's an extraordinary significance placed on matching toponyms and historical sources in all sorts of historiography, but particularly the historiography of Azerbaijan. Mm-hmm. The strong capitals have all been linked to specific places, particularly Barda and Ganja, Baku. I imagine there's no dispute really there. But there has been a lot of debate about where Barda is in order to create this link between the present and the past. In a way, my own approach to thinking about the city is a little bit removed from that. There is a large city that we are excavating. The evidence of it is produced in the material culture. We have something like 21,000 sherds of pottery and substantial evidence of residences and the occupation of a city. And I think it's fair to call it that, both in terms of the spread as well. We've looked at what the spread might be. So we have a city, a very large city in the Caucasus. Whether or not you directly link that to Barda, I think will always be open to debate. But I think the point is more that this is certainly, we can consider the administrative centre of this region, in particularly the 10th to the 12th century. Now, anybody who's been paying attention will note that that's slightly later than the dates that I've been talking about. And this is one of the interesting factors we've found so far, is that in fact Barda doesn't decline in the 10th century, as the traditional narratives would say. It is actually flourishing at that time. So after the attack of the Rus in the 10th century, it seems to actually have taken off again, which is completely counter to every historical description that we have.
And I mean, the historical descriptions, when they talk about the decline of Barda, they don't just mention some disaster that happens and then sort of assume that that ruins everything. They do actually talk about the city declining.
There are, but already by the late 10th century, there are accounts of certain parts of the city being in decline. There's one comparative source which talks about the number of bakeries going from being in the hundreds to down to less than 10, which seems an exaggeration. But one of the interesting things I found about the sort of going into the 11th and 12th centuries, there is one mirror for princes which has an anecdote about Barda. And I won't go into too much detail about it, but basically it's a dispute, and as part of the dispute there is a debate about whether a military officer should be sent to Barda. And he pleads and says, no, I can't possibly go to Barda, the climate is too unhealthy, I shouldn't go. And the response of the vizier to him is basically that surely you'll be fine, you can only die when Allah wills it, and therefore you'll be absolutely fine. And he says, yes, you're absolutely right, I will die when Allah wills it. And his phrase is, but no one goes to Barda unless his time has come. So I can somewhat sympathise in the hot days of excavating in the summer. But so it seems that at least in a literary sense, by the 11th and 12th century, it is seen as somewhere where you don't really want to go to. It's not an attractive place. Unlike Ganja of the time, where people are waxing lyrical, and of course we have the works of Nizami Ganjavi associated with as being a great literary centre. This is the capital which seems to take over, or at least on the traditional narrative, from Barda, slightly to the north, further up the Kura River.
And you don't think that this was just the resonance of the story of the dysentery of the Rus that damaged the reputation of Barda?
Well, it may well be.
Generations.
It may well be, but also at the time, the whole of the Caucasus is fragmenting into much smaller political units. And so what we see, well, at least ostensibly on the surface of histories that are written about them, they appear to be talking in quite disdainful ways about how there's a lack of control, and there's a frequent exchanging of boundaries and borders and cities throughout the 11th and 12th centuries. And then you also have sort of the nomads as well, who are not seen as particularly positive force.
I know that before working on Barda, you worked on two other of the important cities, I mean much bigger cities of the northern frontiers of the Islamic world, one being Marv, now in Turkmenistan, one being Balkh, now in northern Afghanistan. And I just wondered whether, I mean, I could tempt you, I know you've done 2 seasons digging in Barda so far, and that's not been part of a huge project. That's been very much, your own digs. There hasn't been a vast archaeological infrastructure around that to help you draw wider conclusions. But I think it'd be very interesting for us to know whether, on the basis of what you've seen so far, you think there are comparisons to be made among these frontier cities, or whether you feel that you're really any closer to answering your initial question, is there something special about frontier cities compared to cities that are deeper in the interior?
Yes, I think I'd be quite careful about saying whether Merv and Balkh were frontier cities per se. I think they have frontier aspects of them. But one of the most striking features about Barda'a, which I don't see so much at Merv, I don't see much at Balkh, in terms of its material culture, is the quantity of local material culture. It seems to have a very localized identity compared to places like Merv, which seem to have this very cosmopolitan identity, people passing things through. Particularly, I'm talking really in terms of ceramics, because that's the most visible aspect we have. Also in terms of glass, incidentally. So it seems as though Barda'a is actually quite unlike Merv and Balkh. They're much larger cities. They have a much greater number of people passing through and a greater attraction for that. One of the interesting factors about Barda'a is we don't actually have any evidence of its city wall. I think one of the popular conceptions of how you have a frontier town is it's very heavily defended, and that's a sort of necessary attribute. And actually taking this project forward, one of the things that I would like to look at in the future is not to compare it with major urban sites like Merv and Balkh, but actually to compare it with ones on similar scale to Barda'a, which form the frontier between sort of southern edge of the grassland steppe in southern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan. Because they have very similar aspects in terms of their form as well, and are not necessarily walled in the early stages of their history either. So they have this seemingly quite open relationship with the landscape surrounding them, which is quite unusual and quite interesting.
Okay, I think looking at the clock, it's probably, and thinking that people probably need to be somewhere else at 2, I should perhaps be quiet and let other people ask questions.
I was about to say that. Right, let's bring up questions.
You mentioned, I think, 21,000 sherds that you found. Could you tell us a little bit more about the ceramic evidence and what you are learning from the ceramic evidence?
Yes, 21,000 sherds, and I should say that we haven't even scratched the surface in terms of what we might do with them. They can tell us an awful lot about all sorts of aspects of life in Barda'a. Most notably, one of the things we're looking at is where do they come from? Are they being produced locally, as I mentioned, or are they being produced further away and being traded in? To try and give us some sort of context about the links that the city has with other cities, with rural areas as well. We also get some indication of the lifestyle in terms of the types of wares that are being used. Particularly, we are looking out for whether they can be considered luxurious wares or very rudimentary. The answer to that question is we have a mix, of course, even though we're digging in an area which has been tentatively suggested as the administrative heart, possibly the palace. But we have no evidence of that whatsoever. But most importantly, what the ceramics give us is a better idea of dating. Because we have this wonderful stylistic sequence of what are referred to as Islamic ceramics, for want of a better word. But what I mean is ceramics of the medieval world that are very highly glazed, that often have epigraphic motifs on them, but also the style changes very quickly. So we use them as a good chronological indicator for understanding how the city develops through time. There are other aspects, but what they do cover quite a wide chronology, and so one of the things we have to do is to find people who are interested in working on different aspects. We have a PhD student who's just started in the Oriental Institute who will be working on the post-Mongol aspect, but desperately seeking someone to work on the slightly earlier period.
Just with respect to the palace, it's remarkable how often archaeologists working on a particular building say, this must have been a palace. It never seems to be anything less grand. What do you think about identification, and what is some of the evidence that people have used to say that it was a palace?
I think people imagine palaces to be the grandest, the largest buildings that they see. And what I've seen, if you read sort of archaeological excavations that go on over maybe 20 or 30 years, as a newer, grander building is excavated, that's the new palace. So it sort of shifts depending on the biggest building you've found. But I think also people are surprised in the quality of material culture. And particularly, as I say, with the Islamic period in sort of the Persian world, in the high medieval period. And in many ways, that's led people to say, well, you know, because we have all these wonderful ceramics in this very luxuriant material culture, then it must be palatial. But it seems to be a little bit more widespread than one would imagine. There is a reasonably substantial production of high quality material. And there seems to be a high level of consumption. This is a truly consumer society. They're getting through a lot of material, even in relatively modest domestic contexts.
Paul, I didn't understand about the walls. You're digging in the middle of the city, and you say you haven't found any walls. Well, that's what one would expect. And presumably the roofs, before they get their dysentery, are sitting around outside of something that's stopping them from
coming in. Exactly, this appears to be the case. The walls, the way we've tried to approach the walls is to actually look through topographic modelling of the wider city. Unfortunately, at the moment, the city has expanded since the 1970s because of Soviet expansion, but we have aerial images from before the 1970s at its sort of not original state, but a much smaller state. And there's no sort of topographic variation or anything that would give us an indication of any bounding of the city or any walls at all. And when I sort of talking about walls, the sort of typical walls of that area would be an unfired mud brick, large rammed earth structures, which tend to be, I mean, they can be destroyed, but they tend to leave at least some sort of marker or a ditch and bank or something. But that doesn't appear to be the case. Now, I might be wrong. What we'd like to do is do a lot more sort of small excavations around and try and find whether there's a wall. You'd think there would certainly be at least a wooden palisade to stop the Rus or something like that, which would keep them at bay. Having said that, they may have felt that if there were camps and troops stationed around the city, that was simply a sort of means to not coming in. I mean, the way that sieges were done in that sense is not laid out clearly, at least in that particular source. Yeah, I mean, you would expect there to be something, but there just simply isn't any evidence so far. But we shall see.
A supplementary, you've got a 10 by 10 square. How far down have you got? Have you got down to bedrock, or have you got down to sustainable?
No, we've actually, I did sort of was a bit confused there, but we've actually got 3 10 by 10 squares. It's quite substantial. One's in a different site entirely. No, we haven't got down to bedrock at all. We were expecting to go down very quickly, but we're at 2.5 to 3 meters, and we're still in the 10th century at the earliest, if not 11th century, if I'm being more conservative. It appears we've got anecdotal reports of when people have dug toilets for their houses and things, and they've gone down very deep, that there might be up to 6 meters of stratigraphy. Toilets, cisterns for toilets. Yeah, we're not digging those. Yeah, no. So that gives us some indication. But what it should say is that the material that we're getting in the upper layers has a lot of residual material from the 4th and 5th and 6th centuries in it. So we believe that there is continuous. Every pointer is towards the fact that we do have continuous occupation there. We're actually trying to look at all of the layers as comprehensively as possible. There is a temptation to sort of go down as quickly as possible because you want to find the early stuff. But it's actually fascinating looking at these upper layers, the sort of early modern period in the city as well, because we know absolutely nothing about that at all.
I think we probably should draw to a much, Paul, and thank you all very much for coming, and we'll reconvene next term. Thank you very much.